Medieval times have a reputation for being generally really restrictive, but this religious ceremony was definitely an exception, and was instead well known for being an enormous party, where fighting, drinking, and lewd behaviour were common. So, get your good clothes on, get your root beer, and let's get white girl wasted. Before we get into that, we need some backstory. The Rushbearing celebration came from very humble beginnings in the 6th century, where Pope Gregory I asked the Anglo-Saxons of what is now England to convert their pagan temples into Christian ones, first by sprinkling holy water on the ground, then laying rushes on the dirt floors. For those who don't know, rushes are basically thin reeds, kind of like hay. It wasn't quite clear when Rushbearing festivals would happen, as there was no set date. This is because most churches decided the date individually. Sometimes it would coincide with the name day of the saint that the church was named after. Sometimes it was a Sunday during the springtime, where there was plenty of flowers that could be laid on the floor. You'd think when the new rushes were brought in, the old stuff would be cleared out, right? Well, this wasn't always the case. As royal doctor and eminent smack talker Erasmus once remarked, as to the floors, they are usually made of hay, covered with the rushes that grow in the fens, which is so slightly removed now and then that the lower part remains sometimes for 20 years together. And in it, a collection of spittle, vomit, urine of dogs and men, scraps of fish, and other filthiness not to be named. Hence, upon change of weather, a vapour is exhaled, very pernicious in my opinion, to the human body. So we see, just like the Middle Ages are likened to the teenage years of civilization, we also see the hygiene of most houses was similar to that of the average teenager's bedroom. But instead of rushes covered in scraps and food and urine, and exhaling a pernicious vapour, we instead have dirty laundry, schoolwork, and junk food wrappers being piled layer upon layer, year after year, exhaling a somewhat different but nonetheless notable stank. Anyway, over hundreds of years, celebrations became less about stanky reeds and more about having a good time. Celebrations associated with this event became larger and grander. By the time of King James I, around 1,000 years later, this had gone from being a humble festival to becoming the medieval equivalent of a frat party. Needless to say, most celebrated Rushbearing by getting absolutely wasted. This included everyone in town from peasants to lords who would mingle with some degree of freedom despite the rigid classes. One notable example is a Rushbearing event involving church minister Tristram Tildesley. But, like most drunk nights out, we only have fragments of what actually happened as we try and attempt to piece the previous night's celebration together. What we know is instead of conducting his Sunday services, he instead went out bowling, dressed as a mercenary, that is, wearing a sleeveless cloak, a cape and a sword, and going out for a boogie. From his own account called Drinkings and Rushbearings, written in the third person, in his dancing and after wantonly and dissolutely he kissed a maid, whereat divers persons were offended and so sore grieved that there were weapons drawn and a great dissension arose. A farmer William Jackson gave an additional testimony, that Tristram was so lusty in his dancing that either he kissed or offered to kiss the said hunter's daughter, a young woman, and the young fellow who kissed her was beaten on the face by Sir Tristram, or by some other standing by, but as he remembereth it was Sir Tristram, so that many swords were drawn and a great tumult would like to have been. Yet another source says that Tristram Tildesley, the minister of Rutherford and Marston on Sundays and holidays, hath danced amongst light and youthful company both men and women at weddings. So suffice to say he was a bit of a cheeky boy. And if you thought that church ministers dancing was the weirdest thing to happen during Rushbearing festivals, you would be very wrong. Some people went even further, as explained by the town of Cawthorne in 1596. The persons did arm and disguise themselves, some of them putting on women's apparel, some of them putting on long hair and vizards, and others arming themselves with the furniture of soldiers, and being there thus armed and disguised, did they go from the church, and so went up and down the town showing themselves. And this happened in the Middle Ages, where punishment for these kinds of things involved huge fines, being put in the stocks, and sometimes being mutilated or branded. Unfortunately, such fun would not last. Although the Rushbearing festival was recognised as a sport at the time of King James I, by the time of the English Civil War only decades later, such rowdy revelry would have quickly come to an end under Puritan government. And as more churches were rebuilt and renovated in the economic expansion that followed the war, floors were no longer made of packed dirt, but instead of stone and wooden floorboards. And pews were introduced into the churches instead of having people kneel on the floor for the entirety of the service. So you'd think that rush-bearing would have reached an end at this point. For the most part, you'd be right, but some towns actually enjoyed it so much that they continued, and the celebration became even crazier. By the mid-18th century, it was common for people to bring rushes by the cart instead of by hand, and carts were usually decorated with ribbons or banners, sometimes even with silverware. Think of it like a huge parade float. In large towns, there were multiple floats, and this eventually became something of a competition between the different groups of families in the town, who, while drunk, would race floats to the church for the enormous reward of 5 shillings. Now, assume correctly that this was not just a bit of fun. There was an intense rivalry between each float, which would often fight each other if they had the chance. On one occasion, a fight got so heated that it actually ended up with someone being shot. At this point, the festival was something like a holy death sport, where Mad Max-style wagons full of reeds and covered with tinsel and silver plates, piloted by drunken peasants, would wage war against each other with pitchforks. Now that's an Olympic sport I'd like to see. Imagine if every float in the New York Thanksgiving parade raced each other to the finish, and started beating each other up and shooting each other. Unfortunately, the rush-bearing tradition largely died out in the late 19th century, though it continues in very few towns within Great Britain. It isn't anywhere near as wild as it once was in the days of yore. Now that's because these days most rush-bearers are children who usually don't want to get drunk and beat each other up. And that's where it's going to end for now. And remember, the next time your parents ask you to clean your room, just put another layer of clothes on the floor and celebrate by throwing a wild party. Hey kids, do your pal a favor and like and subscribe so I can give you more low quality content like this.